Hey everyone, it's Michael GoosebumpsFan. Today I'm going to be talking about more scary stories to tell in the dark, which is the second book in the three-book trilogy, whatever you want to call it, the series from the 80s and 90s from Alvin Schwartz, the writer here, or the adapter from urban legends and folklore stories and whatnot. And also the illustrations are done by Stephen Gammell, the original artist for the books. This is a book that has all three of the books in there. It's a treasury is what it used to be called, with the old collections they used to put out, which I thought was a really cool looking book. And I love this one too, with the art from one of the stories in here is actually the cover art of this particular hardcover. These books, of course, like I said, are collections and adaptations of old horror stories and kind of folklore and urban legend type stuff from all these different countries and, you know, mainly the US type stuff. And I love them. I eat them up all the time. In the last 2 years, as I said in my previous video, you're probably going to hear a lot of the same things I said in my previous video, just because all three of the books are so similar. They have a lot of completely different stories in all three of the books. But there's a lot of things I'd like to share in case this happens to be the first video you come to on my channel, just to try to have some familiar stuff out there. So if you've seen my previous video, if you happen to already be a subscriber or a recent viewer, then I'm sorry. I just have to repeat some of the stuff for the newer viewer or newer comer, whatever. These are folklore stories adapted to just short, between a page long and a 5-page long story, and they are always effective. I love these. In 2018, I had a back injury earlier that year, and I didn't really have anything I could do. A lot of the time I was kind of just sitting in bed. Couldn't really go anywhere. I had to stop working for a very long time. I had to go through physical therapy and whatnot over time. And at one point, I started getting into Goosebumps again. I started reading Goosebumps 1 of the Haunted Mask, a book that my grandparents had gotten me many years ago. My grandmother, who was the person who probably paid for that at the time, she was dead. She's been dead since 2015. So for me, it was something to just read something just because I missed her. And I've lived in the same house all the time since she passed away. And I pretty much grew up in this house. And I wanted something to read, so I read that. I got really into Goosebumps all over again. I started buying all the Slappy books, and then that eventually snowballed into buying all the books in general. But I had remembered these books that my cousins had shown me many years ago when we were kids, mainly the first book of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark book series. And I remember how much the art stuck with me and how much it terrified me. Stephen Gammell's artwork, as I said in my previous video once again, really complements and finishes and even supersedes a lot of the time the stories that Alvin Schwartz is writing here. It's fantastic. And I mean, these books are only like 80 pages at the most, maybe, and at the end of the book you have a lot of notes and whatnot about where the urban legends came from, where these folklores kind of originate, the different twists on the tales, because some of the books, especially in the first book, you'll have certain stories that are kind of familiar, you can tell. It's kind of a retelling at certain points of the same story, but in different areas where they would tell them a certain way in different countries that Alvin Schwartz had studied. But the thing for me is that at one point, I started in 2018, I picked up all three of the books. There was I wanted the original art, because at some point in 2010 or so, they got Brian Helquist to come in and do really watered down, not scary artwork almost at all. Most of the artwork was so bad. It completely ruined what Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was legendary for, and how much it scared kids, how much it scared adults, all the fighting over the banning of the books many years ago, back in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of trouble with these three books in the press and in public schooling and everything else. And Alvin Schwartz had to go through a lot, and I think Stephen Gammell did too. But I think Alvin Schwartz went through a lot more, honestly, from what I could tell. And I read these books for the first time as an adult. Right now I'm turning 26 at the end of the year. So I was about 23 or 24, somewhere in there, when I read these books for the first time in my entire life, even though I had read little things here and there. I wasn't really about the stories when I was a kid. It was more about the pictures. That's what all the kids I knew, including my cousins that showed me the books, that's all people cared about, was the scary story artwork. Not so much the stories. The first one I ever read was Big Toe, the first story ever for Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. It's from the first book, the first story that ever premiered for these books. As soon as you open that first book, that's the first one you read. And that one did not really get to me the way it should have been, in my opinion. But over the years, I've come to love the story, especially when I started reading these for the first time. But all three of these books, I bought them again in 2018, before the film was announced or anything in 2019. And I fell in love with how amazing these stories are, and how creepy they are, and how they hold up almost 40 years later after production and publishing and everything else. You have newer versions coming out left and right, whether it be the Treasury hardcovers like this, or whether it be the individual books. I now own pretty much every version of the books that have ever existed, just because I'm a collector of this, on the side of being a big collector of Goosebumps, because I love Goosebumps. These are something so much like Goosebumps that I would recommend tremendously for anybody who hasn't read them before. That's why my title is things like Goosebumps, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, instead of just a book review title. I love these. I think they're incredible. I think if you're a Goosebumps fan, or you happen to have kids that are Goosebumps fans, if they want to step up the game a little bit and read something that's going to freak them out and probably stick with them the rest of their life, or you want to read something to them that'll probably stick with them the rest of their life, it's kind of like the equivalent of showing a kid Jaws for the first time when they're like 6 or 7. It's one of those things they will never get over that as long as they live. I promise you. Even if you're an adult like I was the first time I saw Jaws, it's going to stick with you the rest of your life. Because I have a fear of water in general. Just, well, not so much water and swimming, but fish. I don't like fish, and I don't like sharks. I don't like any of that stuff. So Jaws hit me on a personal level, you know. But this book series will get to your kids, and it'll get to you probably if you read it as an adult like I did. And this second book, I would say, is probably the weakest out of all 3 of the books in total. But I still love it. I think it's beautiful. I think the art is beautiful, just as beautiful in the previous books, or than the previous book, or compared to the others, because they're all done by the same 2 guys, Alvin Schwartz and Stephen Gammell. Let's talk about some of my favorite stories in here. I might show you the artwork every once in a while, but some of the biggest highlights that come to my mind when I think about this book is, for example, the first story that I really think about is in the first section of the book, called Hoo-Ha's. When she saw him, she screamed and ran. This story is called Somebody Fell from Aloft, and it happens to take place with a ship on the sea. And I think it is one of the most enormous inspirations probably for Pirates of the Caribbean. Not like a silly comedy Johnny Depp type thing, but you know how Pirates of the Caribbean kind of has this scary horror thing going for it? This has a lot of that in it. If you like Pirates of the Caribbean, I think you'll love this, even though they may or may not take place around the same time period. I don't know, but Somebody Fell from Aloft, it's pretty terrifying, in my opinion. For some reason, there are so many stories in this book series, and I read them so fast the first time I read them, and even now I've read them like 5 times, all the books, back to back, over and over again for the last 2 years. And I would still argue that some stories I have not had completely settle in. Some of the stories just have not settled in entirely about what they are or how effective they actually are. This time around, when I read it recently, about a couple of weeks ago, Somebody Fell from Aloft hit me in such a way this time that I had not realized how spooky and eerie that atmosphere to that story is. It shows Alvin Schwartz's masterful way of telling stories. The dude just, he was incredible. I love his work. I think he is probably one of the best scary storytellers of all time. I think the dude is just amazing as a writer. He is such a dry storyteller. Again, he doesn't add a single word in there that doesn't need to be in there. The pages might end up being about 5-page long stories a lot of the time, but dude, he will kick your feet out from under you the way he tells a tale. And that one is a fantastic example of that. Moving along, the next section of the book has a particular story that I love to death called The Bride. The Bride is terrifying. I don't want to tell you too much about that, about a bride on her wedding day, and it's pretty spooky. The story immediately after that is called Rings on Her Fingers. That's good. The story after that is called The Drum. That's a fantastic story about obeying your parents. I think it's an extremely good story about 2 kids wanting a drum from a creepy lady that they've seen. Wonderful Sausage is also in that section of the book, and Wonderful Sausage is the most horrifically uncomfortable, gross thing I've ever read in my life. I don't want to tell you anything about it, as a matter of fact. It is really disturbing. The thing with Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, just as a heads up, I forgot to say this in my first video for the first book. The thing with these books and these stories is that they do not shy away from gore. They don't have any cursing to them. There's nothing like that. They're very scary. Very, very scary. Traumatizing in some ways, I'd say. They do not shy away from gore. They have some really spooky stuff in here. Wonderful Sausages it might just be a story that you might want to skip if you tell your kid about it, depending on how old they are, how well they hold scary information. The Wonderful Sausages is a terrifying story, in my opinion. It's really gross, really, 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 really bloody. You don't want to do that. just saying. Just saying. Let's see. The Man in the Middle is in the 3rd section of the book. It's a pretty good story about a lady on a train, I believe is what it was, or a subway or something like that. I think it was a train, though. And 2 guys get on the train and holding up one of their friends that seems drunk. It's kind of weird acting. And they get on the train and sit down, and that's a pretty cool ending to that story. I thought it was pretty wild. First time I ever read that. Let's see, The Bed by the Window. The Bed by the Window may very well be my favorite of the entire book. I think it is hands down the best story in here. Basically, you have like like it's like in a nursing home, or not a nursing home, a nursing home where you have elderly folk and whatnot, an elderly home type of thing. I believe is what it was, or an asylum. I don't know, hospital. I don't remember what it was. And these guys stay in the bed all day long, but only one of them sitting closest to the window can actually see outside, and he kind of describes to the other guys what he sees all the time to try to make them feel a little bit better with all the sickness and everything going on inside of there. And one guy gets the idea to try to murder the guy that's beside the bed, or beside the window, so that he can now be moved down, because that's how the process works in this place, that now he'll be moved over to that guy, the guy that he wants to kill's spot, so he can now see out the window and have a better time looking out there, because otherwise he's just watching walls and doctors and nurses and stuff all the time. The moral to that story, and a lot of these stories, pretty much all of them, have some kind of moral to them. The moral of The Bed by the Window is one of the most Twilight Zone type things I've ever read in my life, and I think it is so effective and so timeless. I think it's absolutely timeless. That's another word to use with these stories. These stories are so timeless the way Schwartz wrote them that they work even now in 2020. They're effective, they have all the punches not pulled from them, the effective illustrations work even more, you know, they enhance how scared you can feel with some of these stories. But stories like this, the art for The Bed by the Window, reflect so well the kind of mentality that that whole story has going for it, the way the moral is and everything. I love it. The Bed by the Window, very easily probably my favorite story of the entire book. Easily. Not this whole like 3-book collection here, but at least the second book, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. It's fantastic. The Dead Man's Hand is another really good one that I loved a lot. The Dead Man's Hand is really spooky, for the most part. It has a great moral to it as too. A bunch of kids decide, they're all working in like in a morgue type thing, being trained for that kind of job. And one girl they decide to spook, and they tie a dead man's hand that they took from a body onto a light switch. And, you know, for a lot of people who don't know, usually back in the day I had to pull a switch from you know, the ceiling to turn on a light in cabinets and closets and stuff. When she reaches up to turn on the light, she grabs a dead man's hand and basically has like a creepy handshake. And that's an eerie story. It really gets to me even thinking about that, because I feel like if I had worked in that field ever in my life, that I'd probably be the person that people would pull that joke on, just because people are mean, and people know people like myself are scaredy cats. But it is traumatizing. That story is so spooky, and the ending, I think, the way it's worded, the way Schwartz goes about telling the moral, I think works impeccably. I think it works so well. It's a great thing to discuss with your kids. And it sounds like it probably wouldn't be, with the whole hand of a dead guy hanging from a light switch string. But the moral is impeccable. I love it. I think it's really, really good. Let's see. What's some other stuff? The brown suit's really good. I don't want to tell you too much about that. That's pretty much it. The ones I really want to hit on, too. Here's some art for you. One Sunday morning, pretty good in here, by the way, too, about a lady going to church, and the other churchgoers are not very, they're not who she remembers being there. Anyway, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark inside of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark book collection, trilogy, series, box set, whatever you want to call this thing. It's fantastic. I love it a lot. I think there's a lot to be had fun-wise here and a lot of things to be discussed moral-wise, and the stories that are in here are really good. Again, I didn't highlight as many as I did in the previous video. I think the first book is much better than this book. This is probably, like I said, the weakest of the whole series for me. But it's still great. It's still effective. It has some amazing stories in here that really hit home in a lot of ways. And it's great. Again, these books are all about 80 pages apiece, not including the notes and little origin type things about the different stories, where they came from inside of the countries and the US and whatnot. If you like all that stuff, Alvin Schwartz included that in the book just for you. Just for you. People like myself who just want to read the stories, it's about 80 pages, and it flies by really fast. So this book is about 300 pages, approximately, in that area, when you don't include the notes. But anyway, what are your thoughts on... Oh, by the way, this is the dead man's hand right here that I was telling you about from the light switch. It's the string it's hanging from. What are your thoughts on More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark? Do you love the book? Do you hate the book? What do you think about it? Put your thoughts and comments down below, guys. I'd love to hear what you have to say about the book series. They're all three so good. Nobody talks about them anymore. They're so good. And the movie last year was great, too. You think that would have reinvigorated how great these stories were and brought them back to the forefront and attention to people. It's a shame. It's really a shame, in my opinion. But anyway, when I had to rate these, if I had to rate these, excuse me, on a 5-star basis, I'd probably give More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark probably a 5 out of 5. I love it. I think it's fantastic, man. Again, it's the weakest of the series, but it's still strong when it comes to kids literature or kids horror stories or anything like that. If you want to consider this young adult, you could do that too, for teenagers and whatnot. But you can read this to your kids, or your kids can read it by themselves, and it's going to have an effect on them probably, regardless of which way you go. But again, I read this for the first time as an adult, and it scared the crap out of me too. And I've grown up on horror all my life. And these stories are not just typically bloody and scary and gory like that. They're genuinely frightening stories in the sense of being creepy and have amazing build-up to finales that just have morals sometimes and sometimes don't, but they're still scary and really kind of just eerie, like in that Twilight Zone way with the Bed by the Window story I talked about. But great book. I loved it to death. I think going through the books, or the stories listed in this book, I do stand by that I think Bed by the Window is probably my favorite story in the whole book. Amazing story. Really, really great. But anyway, what are your thoughts on all these books, these stories, and this particular book? Put your thoughts and comments down below, guys. I would love to hear what you have to say about all of it. And thank you for watching. May the Lord Jesus Christ bless you guys today, and goodbye.